So you finally got your hands on a DSLR camera and now you're thinking, now what? Don't worry, in today's video, we're gonna go over camera anatomy, camera physiology, and how to choose camera settings for filming. What's up guys, I'm Jasmine and I'm gonna skip my usual intro because we have a lot to go over. Now that being said, I wanna give a quick disclaimer. This is meant to be a beginner-friendly explanation of how to use a DSLR camera. My analogies are meant to simplify your understanding. They're not going to be completely accurate analogies. They're just meant to help you understand if you're completely new to using a DSLR camera. That being said, I will have articles and videos that explain the functions of a DSLR camera in more technical depth if that's what you want or need. But other than that, there is a lot of information in this video, so this will be broken into 3 parts for the most part, and there might be subsections. If at any time you feel overwhelmed, please pause the video and take a deep breath. Also, there is a setting on YouTube where you can change the speed of a video. So if you need to watch this a little bit more slower, or if you think I'm speaking too slow, you can adjust how fast this video plays. Other than that, let's get started because we have a lot to get into. Let's start with camera anatomy. Now, I evolved with Canon, so I'll be using the Canon T8i as a reference, but the buttons we're going to be talking about are similar on other models such as Sony or Nikon. Also, sometimes the buttons on Canon cameras are in different places depending on the model you're using. We're not going to talk about every single button, just the buttons that you are more likely to use as a beginner. So with that being said, let's start with the anatomy of the bottom of your camera. The bottom of your camera is 9 times out of 10 going to have a 1/4 screw hole so that you can screw on a tripod or screw on another piece of equipment onto the bottom of your camera. You're also likely to have a battery door. Now, when you open this battery door, some cameras also have a slot for you to put your memory card into. My camera, however, if I turn it to the side, has a separate slot that I open so that I can place my memory card. Moving on to the back of the camera. Now, your camera may look different or have buttons in different areas. So if I mention a button and you don't see it, check the top of your camera. If you don't have it, don't panic, it's fine. The most obvious thing that you're going to see when you look at the back of your camera is your screen. I believe it is an LCD screen. That's what I've been calling it at least. But either way, this is where you see the playback of your images. And depending on the model of your camera, you can even use your LCD screen as the viewfinder. Now, the actual viewfinder of your camera is right above the LCD screen, and it looks like a little tiny window that you can look through. To the right of your viewfinder, you may see a button that has a red dot. This is typically your record button, or you may have a button that has a camera on it and a red dot next to the button. That indicates that it is the record button and it is the button to switch to your electric viewfinder, which is just the LCD screen. To show you what I'm talking about, I'm going to press the button and now my LCD screen has turned into my viewfinder. If I press it again, I have to look through the actual viewfinder to see my image. To the left of my viewfinder, I have the menu button and an info button. Now your menu button might be on the right side of your viewfinder. It might be more toward the bottom of your camera depending on your model. But anyway, the menu button is how you get to all of your internal camera settings. This is where you can set up wireless functions, you can erase images. I recommend looking at the pamphlet that comes with your camera just to get a better explanation of everything you can do with the menu button. Now, the next button I want to talk about is the Q button. The Q button is basically the settings button for when you are filming or taking photos. When you press this, it will show you all of the settings such as your aperture, your shutter speed, your ISO, picture style, things of that nature show up when you press the Q button. We'll talk about those types of settings later on in the video. Now, one of the most obvious buttons you'll see is a ring or a circle with different buttons on the top, right, bottom, and left. Now, depending on your camera, the type of settings you see on each part of this ring might be different, but don't worry, okay? If you see letters that say AF, that indicates that if you press the AF button, you can choose the type of autofocus. If you see a bunch of squares that kind of look like the blades of a ceiling fan, this is how you select your picture style. When you see kind of what looks like a timer and a remote, or a bunch of squares stacked on top of each other, this indicates that if you press this button, you can control your timer if you want to use a timer, or you can control your shooting mode. For example, if I'm shooting athletes playing a football game, I can press this button and turn on high speed shooting so that every time I press the shutter button, it takes multiple pictures at a time. Surrounding these buttons, you may have a ring, and this ring can rotate clockwise or counterclockwise. This comes in handy whenever you are messing with certain settings on your camera. For example, if I want to adjust my aperture, I can rotate this ring to the left to get a bigger aperture, to the right to make my aperture smaller. The next button that I have on the back of my camera, and you most likely have on the back of yours, is a rectangle with a triangle in the center. This is your playback button. When you press this button, you are going to see the last thing that you took a picture of or that you recorded. And somewhere near that playback button, you might have a designated trash button. That obviously is how you erase images and videos from your camera. Now let's move on to the top of the camera. This is typically where your on and off button is located, as well as your mode ring and your shutter button. So the first thing I want to talk about is your on and off switch. Depending on the camera model that you have, you may also have a video mode switch. My camera has a video mode switch, but my mom's Canon T6 only has an on and off switch, and the video mode is on the mode ring. So just pay a little bit more attention to your camera to see which one yours looks like. If you have a fancier DSLR camera, you might see another small screen at the top of your camera. My camera is an entry-level camera, so it does not have that. Let's talk about the settings on the mode ring. My mode ring has only a few settings compared to other models of cameras. I think that's just something Canon decided to do for this particular model. However, my mom's camera has a bunch of different mode options to choose from. The main ones that I want to talk about are the letters M, AV, TV, P, and then the auto, which is signified by the letter A with a box around it and a plus sign typically. The letter M stands for manual. Manual allows you to control pretty much all of your settings yourself. So your aperture, your shutter speed, your ISO, things of that nature. AV stands for aperture priority. This is a setting where you can control your aperture and your camera will automatically control the settings based on the aperture that you choose and what's going on in front of your camera. TV, this is your shutter speed priority setting, And this allows you to set your shutter speed, and your camera will automatically pick all your other settings based on what's going on in the environment that you are shooting in. P is the programming mode. Under the program setting, your shutter speed and your aperture will be picked by your camera, and you can choose the other settings for yourself. So if you want your ISO to be a certain level, you can change that yourself, but your camera will pick the shutter speed and the aperture. Now, auto is pretty self-explanatory. This just means that your camera will pick the settings automatically. You don't really have to do much work other than press the record button or the shutter button. Your camera will analyze the environment that you're in and pick settings that it thinks will make the best image. This is a very good beginner-friendly button to use if you are absolutely clueless on how to use your camera, but you want to use it because you spent a lot of money. So if you get nothing else from this video, I want to tell you there is no shame in using the auto button when you are new to your DSLR camera. As long as you start using it instead of letting it sit in a corner because you're scared of it, I say more power to you. Your camera may have more settings than that on your mode ring. Just look at the manual that comes with your camera to see what all of those different settings are. The great thing about these cameras too is that they will typically tell you what that setting means anytime you rotate your mode ring to a new setting. So if you're not sure what it is, just twist it to that setting and your camera will tell you what it means. At the top of my camera, I also have an ISO button and a display button. Depending on the mode your camera is on, whenever you press the display button, a different set of settings will pop up for you to look at and customize. The ISO button is what you press to adjust your ISO setting, which we will talk about in the next section of this video. Now, another thing that I haven't mentioned yet is this second ring-like object. This is another way to adjust your settings. Now the ring at the top of my camera helps me to adjust my shutter speed, while the ring at the back of my camera allows me to adjust my aperture. To figure out which one it controls, I just recommend rotating that button and seeing what changes on your screen. So if I started rotating this and I see that my shutter speed starts changing, then I know it's changing my shutter speed. Something I forgot to mention real quick, there is another small, tiny little ring next to my viewfinder, and you probably have one too. And it has a plus, what looks like a plus and a minus sign. This just helps you to adjust your viewfinder to your eyesight. So if you look into your viewfinder and it looks blurry, rotate this little tiny ring until the image looks more sharp. This just helps you to be able to see what you're trying to take a picture of or what you're trying to film. Going back to the top of a camera, the very front of the top of your camera has a shutter button. Now you can half press this to wake your camera up. Your camera will typically go into like a sleep mode where it makes the screen go black. But if you half press your shutter button, it'll wake the camera back up so that the LCD screen lights back up and shows you what you're doing. If you fully press the shutter button, of course, you end up taking a picture. Now moving on to the front of your camera, there's not much going on except for your lens. If you don't have a lens attached, then you have a lens cover, or just kind of like a cover on the front of your camera while there's no lens there. And you might have a button next to the area where the lens goes. It acts as a release button. So when you press it, it allows you to take your lens out of the camera. If you don't have a lens on your camera right now, I want you to go run and get it and put it on your camera so that we can talk about how to read your camera lens. If you take your lens cap off, you should see information about the type of lens that you are using. For example, mine says Canon zoom lens EFS. That's the type of model lens that I'm using. And then I see a set of numbers. Mine says 18 to 55 mm. Mm means millimeters. And this is the focal length of your lens. 18 is the smallest focal length, and then 55 is the longest focal length. And if I rotate my lens to the left or right, my camera lens will zoom in or out. If you look at your lens as if you are taking a picture and then flip it up like you're looking at the top of your camera, you will see a dash and a number. And this dash indicates what focal length you're on when you're using a zoom lens. So if I rotate my lens to the left, it'll start to zoom out and extend, and the dash will tell me how far I'm extending. On the side of my lens, I have a button that shows me if I'm on autofocus or manual focus. AF means autofocus, MF means manual focus, although I'm sure you can think of some other words that substitute MF. The button below that says whether or not my stabilizer is on or off. Depending on the type of lens you have, you might not have a stabilization function, but you more than likely will have a autofocus or a manual focus button that you can flip back or forth. Oh man, that was a lot of talking, but we are done going over the camera anatomy. If there's a button that I did not talk about, please consult your camera manual that came in the box with your camera, because like I said, we're trying to make this as beginner friendly as possible, but still be thorough enough to teach you something about your camera. Okay, now let's talk about camera physiology, or another word is just camera function. So how to use a camera. With this information that I'm going to give you, you should be able to use your camera on manual mode if you choose to. I'm going to give you a general overview of how a camera works, and then we're going to discuss 3 main functions one by one. Do you remember temporary tattoos? You have a piece of paper with a tattoo on it, and then you put the side with the tattoo on your skin, and then you get a wet washcloth and you put that on the back of the piece of paper, and the water causes the tattoo to transfer onto your skin, and when you move the paper, an image is now on your skin. Well, a camera is kind of similar. Now I know that sounds crazy, but let me explain. With a temporary tattoo, you apply water to a piece of paper and then an image is revealed. But with a digital camera, you apply light to a sensor and an image is captured and then revealed. It's not a perfect analogy by any means, but it's the simplest illustration I can think of. And to kind of help you with that illustration, I want you to take the lens off of your camera and look inside. What you're looking at is a mirror that bounces the light that is passing through the lens up to a prism, and that prism shows you what you're looking at through, you got it, your viewfinder. Or if you choose to use the electric viewfinder, it shows up on your LCD screen. What happens is the light hits the sensor, your sensor records the light and shows you an image. So that's why I say that it's kind of like a temporary tattoo, because water applied to paper reveals a tattoo, just like light applied to a sensor reveals an image. There is a very elaborate physics explanation to this. We're not going to talk about it, okay? Anyway, the basics around digital photography is controlling how light hits that sensor. The 3 ways that you can control the relationship between light and the sensor are through aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Let's start with aperture. I want you to take the lens off of your camera and take the lens cover off as well, and then just look through the back of your lens. You see how there's a small circle and you can see what's happening through your lens. You might even see that everything that you're seeing is upside down. Aperture is the opening through which light passes through your camera lens. Think of it as a window. So the smaller the window, the less light that passes through. The bigger the window, the more light that passes through. Obviously, light has to pass through a lens before it can hit the sensor. So you can make your lens have a big window to allow a lot of light to hit the camera sensor, or you can make your lens have a small window so that only a little bit of light can hit your camera sensor. Aperture is indicated by the letter F followed by a number. Now this part is a little bit tricky and counterintuitive, so listen carefully, okay? The smaller the number, the bigger the window, or the bigger the aperture. So an aperture of f1.4, small number, big window, means that a lot of light will pass through the lens to hit the sensor. But an aperture of f22, big number, means small window, which means only a little bit of light will pass through the lens to hit the sensor. How do you know how big or how small the aperture on your lens can go? Well, let's return to the front of our lens. We talked about what focal length looks like, but next to that there is typically a ratio, and that will look like 1 followed by the colon mark and then a number. The number immediately after the colon mark shows you the biggest aperture or the biggest window that your camera lens is capable of. So for example, my lens has a 4 right after the colon mark. That means that the biggest aperture my lens has is f4. The next setting that you can use to control the amount of light that hits the sensor is the shutter speed. Remember the shutter button that we talked about when we went over camera anatomy? Well, inside of your camera, there is a shutter that prevents light from hitting the sensor when you're not taking a picture. Think of a shutter as curtains that cover a window. So we just talked about aperture, which is kind of like a window, and now we're talking about a shutter, which is like curtains for the window. The window is always going to allow light in unless you have a curtain to cover it to prevent light from getting in. If you're not ready to take a picture, you have the curtains closed. When you're ready to take a picture, you press the shutter button, and that makes the curtain open so that light can hit the sensor. From the time that the curtain is open to the time that the curtain is closed, the sensor is recording all the light and gathering information about the image or the video that you just captured. Now, the faster the shutter opens and closes, the less time light has to hit the sensor, and therefore less light hits the sensor overall. Now, the slower that the shutter opens and closes, the more time light has to keep hitting the sensor, which means that there will be more light hitting the sensor overall. Shutter speed can affect how sharp or how blurry an image looks based on what you're trying to capture. If you are capturing a fast-moving object and you want a sharp, clear image, you should use a fast shutter speed so that your camera is quick enough to catch the movement of the object. When your shutter speed is slower than the object in motion, you're going to catch what is something called motion blur in your photo. This is when the movement is not kind of clear. You can kind of see what looks like a hand being dragged from one place to another. Like, you can see the movement a lot more. It's not like it was frozen in time. It's like it caught multiple phases of the movement in one picture. Now, a good rule of thumb when it comes to picking a shutter speed for your camera is to choose a shutter speed that is twice the size of the focal length of your lens. So, for example, we talked about the focal length of my lens being 18 to 55 millimeters. I'm going to look at the biggest focal length that my lens can reach, and I'm going to double that. So since the biggest focal length that this lens can go up to is 55 millimeters, I would want my shutter speed to be at least 1/100 or 1/125. This will help you to not capture the natural movement of your hands while you're holding your camera. If you do want to capture an object with motion blur, it is best to make sure your camera is on a tripod so that you don't have to worry about the movement of your hands and you only capture the movement of your object. When you have a very slow shutter speed, your sensor is exposed to the light for a longer amount of time. Hence why these types of photos are called long exposure. An example of a long exposure photo are those light painting photos where you see people take a glow stick and they move their hand in a certain pattern for a few seconds while the camera shutter is closing, and then the final image looks like one fluid motion of the light. That's because the entire time that they were moving, the shutter was open for a certain amount of time and then it finally closed. That's why if you are trying to do like sports photography or even sports videography, you need to have 1, a lot of light, and 2, a fast shutter speed. You need a fast shutter speed because you need to catch the movement of the athletes in motion. Otherwise, you're going to have motion blur. And you need a lot of light because when your shutter speed opens and closes so fast, you don't have that much time for light to hit the sensor. The third setting that controls how light hits the sensor, or just kind of like the relationship between light and the sensor, is ISO. ISO refers to your sensor's sensitivity to light. I want you to think of ISO like sunglasses. When you put on sunglasses, your eyes are less sensitive to the light around you, and therefore everything looks darker. Similarly, with ISO, the smaller the ISO number, the less sensitive the sensor is to light, and therefore the darker the image will appear. Conversely, the higher the ISO number is, the more sensitive to light the camera sensor is, and therefore the lighter the image will appear. So an ISO of 100 is like wearing super dark sunglasses, and an ISO of 3200 would be like not wearing sunglasses at all. ISO can also affect how sharp your image is, because the more sensitive your camera is to light, the more grainy it'll appear. So if you want a very sharp, crisp looking image, you want to stay on the lower end of the spectrum when it comes to ISO. So I would say anywhere between 1 to 800, depending on the environment that you're in. But this will only work in your benefit if you have a lot of light to begin with, because remember, the lower the ISO, the darker the image will appear. So if you want to use a lower ISO to get a sharp, crisp image, you have to make sure your environment has a lot of light. This brings me to a very important point, which is that rather than immediately jumping into messing with your camera settings when you're about to take a photo or record a video, make sure you first adjust the lighting and the environment that you're in, whether that be opening or closing the window shades, turning on a light, adding some ring lights. Try to adjust the lighting in your setting first before you jump immediately into changing the settings on your camera. Now, sometimes you're outside, you can't really do much because the only light you have is the sun. That's okay. Obviously, you have all you can do, right? So So once you finished adjusting the lighting in your environment, that's when I would go in and start messing with your camera settings. This is called balancing your exposure. All that means is that you are picking the right aperture, shutter speed, and ISO combination until you have a desirable image. And it's called balancing your exposure because all three of those settings, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, alter the way your camera sensor is exposed to light. So now I'm going to show you what balancing your exposure would look like. I'm going to show you how aperture, shutter speed, and ISO affect one another and how they work together to control the amount of light that's hitting your camera sensor. Okay, so beside me, I have my iPad, which is showing us what's happening on my camera. I have a makeshift tripod going on right now, and in the back, I have a box with a painting set as our subject, but we're going to be focusing on my iPad because I can control the settings on my camera from my iPad. So as you can see, my iPad is showing what's going on in front of my camera, but I'm showing you my iPad because it's bigger and I can control the settings from my iPad. In this lower corner, you can see that my camera is in the manual mode. My shutter speed is 1/25. My aperture is at 5 and my ISO is on 20,000, which is super bright. So I don't know if you can tell right now, but this looks very overexposed. So one of the things that we can do to make this darker is we can make our aperture a bigger number, because remember, big number means small window, or we can take the ISO to a smaller number because a smaller number means less sensitive to light, which means darker image, or we can take the shutter speed to a faster speed, which means the bottom number will be bigger because the faster the shutter is open and then closed, the less time light has to hit the sensor. So let's start with switching to a faster shutter speed. If I go this way, now you can see that my image is pretty much perfect. I love the way this looks. If I were to hit this button, a picture is taken. So that is 1/800 with an aperture of 5 and an ISO of 20,000. Well, let's take my shutter speed back to 1/125 and let's see what happens when we change our aperture. Now, so if we want to make this darker using aperture, what we're going to do is we're going to switch to a smaller window to let in less light. So small window means big number. So we're going to drag this over here toward the bigger numbers, and let's see what it looks like on F11. I like F11. We're going to take a picture. And now we pretty much got the same effect as if we had our shutter speed on 1/800. Now let's go back to an aperture of 5, I believe. That's what we had it on. Yes. And now let's say we want to change the ISO instead. We want a really sharp, crisp image. So we're going to adjust our ISO. What are we going to do? We're going to move our ISO to a smaller number to make our camera sensor less sensitive to light. So I'm going to drag it this way. That is with an ISO of 8,000, but I still think it's a little bright. So I'm going to move it again. Let's see what 6,400 looks like. Still a little bright. And now we have 6,200, I believe. I'm waiting for the monitor to adjust. So that's what it looks like at 5,000. Let's go to 3,200 and see what that looks like. 3,200 looks pretty good. It's slightly darker than the other images, so let's go up a little bit. I think somewhere between 4,000 and 3,200 gets us close to the other images. So I'm just gonna put it back on 3,200. Okay, that's what it looks like when the ISO is on 3,200. So I'm going to take the picture. Okay, so as you can see, when you're taking a still image and you have a camera propped up on a surface, it really is a matter of preference. Which setting do I want to change? But there are going to be certain settings when you realize that changing your aperture is the best idea, or changing your shutter speed is the best idea, or changing your ISO is the best idea. So let's talk about when changing your aperture is the best idea. And oftentimes changing your aperture relates to the type of lens you have. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the amount of lighting we have. Let's say we're in a room or we're in an environment where it's a little bit darker. As you can see, my own camera is trying to adjust now, but I'm going to close my shades completely so that we're in a darker room. And now we're gonna play around with the settings on my iPad again. Okay, so this is what the room looks like with my shutters closed. It's a little bit darker than it was before. All I have right now is a ring light lighting the room. So let's see what these settings do now when we try to adjust for a good balanced exposure. Right now, our aperture is on 5, our shutter speed is on 1/125, and our ISO is on 3,200. Since we're taking a still image and our camera is propped up on an item, we really don't have to worry about how fast the shutter opens and closes because nothing in the image is moving. But you are most likely watching this because you're going to be recording videos and you want to learn how to use your DSLR for videos. So if you're recording an object that's not moving for a video, then you really don't have to worry about your shutter speed. But if you're recording something that's moving, you're not going to want to touch your shutter speed too much because then you're going to get what we talked about, which is motion blur. But we still need to make this picture a little bit brighter because it's looking a little underexposed. It might look great on camera right now, but in reality, this is actually a little bit dark. I'm actually going to take a picture so you can see the true color of what's happening on my screen right now. So let's look at changing our aperture or changing our ISO. Now we could change our aperture to a smaller number to create a bigger window and allow more light in, but we're running into an issue where, well, my smallest aperture goes to 5 right now. So that leaves ISO. So what I can do is I can drag this to make the sensor more sensitive to light, and now the image is starting to brighten up. So let's put it on 6400, see how that does. That looks okay, but I still want to add more light to it. So let's go up another notch. 8,000 looks decent. Let's go up a little bit more just to see what the next option looks like. I like 10,000. I think 10,000 is a good amount of light. Just to make sure I'm happy with this, I'm going to go up one more to 12,800. This is a good option too, but I like 10,000 a little bit more. And now I'm going to take this picture. Now, ISO was the most favorable option in this scenario, but the trade-off for going to a higher ISO is that now our image is going to be a little bit more grainy and not as crisp and sharp because we did have to go on to the higher spectrum of ISO. So in a case where you're filming yourself, let's say, especially if you're filming a moving object, the best setting to control in this situation would probably be aperture. Now you're obviously going to adjust all of these settings to get the most favorable results. Like you might adjust your aperture and your ISO, but in this case we went as low as we could for aperture, so the only thing left to adjust was ISO because we didn't want hypothetical motion blur. But just to show you what would happen if we did go to a slower shutter speed, I'm going to put this back on 3200 where it was, and then I'm going to adjust the shutter speed to, let's say, 1/60. Okay, that helped a little bit, but not really. Mm, 1/30 looks nice. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go hold the camera and press the shutter button, and we're gonna see what kind of result we get when I take the picture. Do you see how it picked up on the natural movement? Wait, let's go back. Let's review the image we just took. And it doesn't look too bad. It actually looks really good. But once again, this object is still, and it only really caught the movement of my hand. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna put a timer on, and I'm going to move my hand in front of the camera to show you guys what would happen if you were trying to take a picture of something that was moving. Actually, let's do a 10-second timer so that I have more time to get over there. There we go. So we're gonna let it count down. Now let's see what happened if you were trying to take a picture of a moving object. You see how my hand is blurry? You can kind of see through my fingers because it caught the motion of my hand. That is why I don't recommend messing with your shutter speed in dark situations. If you are shooting a moving object, you can get away with it if you're shooting a still object and you have a tripod. So as we saw just now with the dark environment demonstration, it is more favorable to be able to change your aperture rather than your shutter speed or your ISO in those situations if you don't want to compromise the sharpness or the crispness of your image. But sometimes your lens just doesn't go to a big enough window. But I do have a lens, however, that goes to a much larger window or aperture, and it is denotated by the f1.4 here on the box. And as you can see, the focal length is 30 millimeters. So I'm going to switch the lens on my camera to this lens, which goes to a bigger aperture or a bigger window, and we're gonna try taking a picture in a dark room again to see how changing your lens can change what your camera is capable of doing. The only trade-off about this lens is that it is not a zoom lens. So it is a fixed focal length, meaning if I want to get closer or further away from a subject, I will have to physically move the camera closer or further away. Now, the thing about buying camera lenses that have bigger aperture abilities is that it often comes with a bigger price, unfortunately. So you will find that during your journey with your DSLR cameras that you find yourself saving up for other lenses for the type of content that you want to film. Okay, so we are back in our dark room simulation. I have my blinds closed, but now I am using a different lens. I'm using the Sigma 30mm f1.4 lens. So now let's see what happens. Let me adjust my iPhone screen to the proper exposure for you guys. There we go. So we're still on an aperture of 5, an ISO of 3200, and a shutter speed of 1/125, excuse me. And as you can see, the image still looks the same. But now, if we want to make this image brighter, we have the option of using a bigger window because the aperture has smaller numbers. So now we can create a bigger window. So let's see what f2 point, or that might be a f3. Okay, let's try this again. So let's see what happens when let me move this down a little bit. So let's see what happens when we put our aperture on a smaller number to create a big window. That's what f3.2 looks like. That's what is this? I think that might be 2.5. 2.5 looks pretty decent. Let's go to f2. f.2 looks really good. I'm not liking how my camera is positioned, so let me change that real quick. There we go. Now our subject is more in the center of the screen, but this looks really good. But my ISO is still on 3200 and I want a crisp image, so I'm gonna move this over to 1600, and it starts to get a little bit dark again. But it did get a little bit more crisp and less grainy. And I know I still have some wiggle room over here with my aperture. So I'm gonna go ahead and move it all the way to f1.4. And it's still very nice and bright, which means that I have a little bit more wiggle room over here for my ISO. So let's go down one notch a little bit to 1250. I like that, so I'm going to take a picture. Oh, I forgot my timer is on. So we're gonna wait 10 seconds for this to take a picture, and then we're gonna turn the timer off. Okay, so you see how it really is just a balancing game of adjusting your settings until you like what you see. You could just blindly go in and change the settings, but when you know what they actually do for your image, it makes it easier to pick which setting you want to change. So if I'm trying to change my ISO, do I want my image to be a little bit more grainy, or do I want it to be a little bit more sharp? And if I'm changing my aperture, do I want a lot more light or a lot less light? And if I'm changing my shutter speed, do I want to risk having motion blur, or do I want my images to be very crisp without motion blur? I'm going to open the blinds again, and we're going to see how you would approach the situation when you have a lot of light. Okay, so right now I have every light source possible known to man on in my room. I have my window shades open, and I have my top light on, which you can't see. I have a ring light over in the corner over there. So now what are we going to do to adjust our settings? I want this to be a, once again, sharp, crisp image. And the two settings that can control how sharp or crisp the image looks are shutter speed and ISO. But I like where my shutter speed is. You could change this if you wanted to, but I want to go ahead and change my ISO so that I can really get a sharp, crisp looking image. So I'm gonna move it over to 800. Still very overexposed. Let's go to 400. That's looking a lot better. Let's go to 250. Oh, that's great. I like 250, but let me see what 200 looks like just in case. Yeah, 200 is a little dark, so let's go back to 250. Let's take this photo. Wonderful. So that image is probably going to look a little bit more crisp, not as much grain. But let's say you are somebody who likes shutter speed. Like, I want to change shutter speed. I don't want to touch my ISO. What does that look like? So let me put this back on 1600. I think it was on 1600. And then let me go and mess with my shutter speed instead. So I want to get rid of all the overexposure, which means that I'm going to make my shutter speed faster so that my sensor is exposed to light for a shorter amount of time. So we're going to go to a bigger number. Let's see what 1/250. That's okay. Let's go to 1/500. That's cool too, but I think I can go a little bit darker. I think I can go a little bit darker. I think that's a great shot. So we're at 1/800. Let's take the picture. And I'm going to allow you to look at all the different settings that we have as we're taking these pictures. But yeah, that's the two different ways that you could adjust the lighting in the situation. And I think that's why I think this is a good illustration of how good it is to have a lens that has a wide variety of aperture values, especially in the small number range. So finding lenses that have f1.4, f1.8, f2 are great lens options if you want to be able to shoot in low light, very bright lights, any type of lighting. Aperture is going to be your best friend. And the thing about adjusting my shutter speed, it doesn't harm my video too much, because if I'm moving, that just means that it's going to be better at catching my movement without motion blur because it's a fast shutter speed. But if I were to move it slower, you would risk the motion blur, as I've said before. Okay, so now that we know how to change our shutter speed, aperture, and ISO when we're on manual mode, let's talk about other camera settings that you can alter and customize when you decide to start filming or taking pictures. But I'm primarily talking about video recording in this section. So for this last section, we're going to talk about camera settings such as your resolution, your auto white balance, and what picture style you want to film on. And then we're also going to talk about different modes that you can film on. So the modes that we talked about in the very beginning, such as manual, aperture priority, shutter speed priority, etc. I want to talk about these settings specifically for when you're filming videos, but these same settings, the meanings of these settings, except for video resolution, all apply the same way when you're taking pictures, because after all, video is just a bunch of pictures taken per second and put together to create a moving picture. When you put your camera on video mode, typically the LCD screen will light up as your viewfinder because it's just easier to see what you're doing that way. But to see all the different settings that you can customize, we're going to press that Q button that we talked about in the beginning of the video, and a variety of different options will pop up. I'm going to go in the order that they show up on my camera and talk about those settings. And hopefully they look the same on your camera. If not, try to pay attention to the symbols to find it on your camera. So if I press the Q button, on the left hand side I have the option to change my autofocus method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tap on each of these settings just to show you what each setting does. Right now, my autofocus method is in one point autofocus. What this does is you tap on a certain point that you want your camera to focus on, and it focuses on that point. So maybe you're recording a video of something that's not moving. You can keep your camera focused on that one spot. Or maybe you're focused on a particular area. You can keep your camera focused on that one spot. On the far right, I have zone autofocus. What this allows me to do is pick a zone in the camera bigger than a spot. It's more of like a broad area that you want your camera to focus on, whereas the one point is a much smaller square. So it's like a very small concentrated area that you want your camera to focus on. Next, there is spot autofocus, and there's a even smaller area than the one point autofocus. So like if it's like a minuscule, I need you to focus on his earlobe and his earlobe only, then you would use the spot autofocus function. And then on the far left, we have the face plus tracking autofocus. With this option, your camera will focus on faces or on subjects that you select by touch. So if you select a face, it'll follow that face as you're recording or trying to take pictures. The next option is a timer, and you can choose to keep your timer off or do a 10-second timer, 2-second timer, custom timer, you name it. After that, we go into your recording size, your movie recording size, or your video resolution. Depending on the camera you have, you may have the ability to shoot in 4K or full HD, or if you have an older model, you might only have regular HD, which is 1280 by 720. My camera does have the option to film in 4K at about 24 frames per second, but for the sake of not having super large files, I film on full HD, which is 1920 by 1080, and I keep my frame rate or frames per second on 60 frames per second. Now you can choose 30 frames per second, you can choose 24 frames per second. 24 frames per second is set to be more cinematic because it matches the frames per second that the human eyeball is said to be able to see in. So that's a cool fun fact. The next setting that I want to talk about is stabilization. I don't know if you have this setting on your camera. If you don't have in-body stabilization, then sit tight. But you can choose to have this off, have it reduce motion blur by camera shake when recording movies, or have it like super stabilized where it reduces extreme motion blur due to camera shake. So it's basically just different levels of stabilization. On the right hand side, there is the auto white balance button. And basically what you can do in these settings is choose the white, or choose the type of white balance going on, like the colors going on in your environment. So if you're outside and it's sunny, you can choose the sun for daylight. If you're inside using, or if you're outside in the shade, you can choose the shade option and so forth. Under that, you have picture style. And if you tap on each of these settings, it'll tell you what that picture style is best used for. For example, standard is for general photography and having sharp, vivid images, whereas the auto picture is when the camera will just look at what's going on in your environment and pick the picture style for you. P, portrait, this is ideal for close-ups of people. It smooths the skin and the hair. I don't recommend this for video or vlogging unless you kind of want that like video filter effect where like it makes your skin look flawless. I like to let my skin just look how it looks. Next, we have the lighting optimizer option. Now you can do auto. This basically auto corrects the brightness and the contrast going on in your image. It's disabled when you have your camera on manual, but if you have your camera on another setting, you can go through and actually pick this setting to do what you want it to do for your image. This is really about customizing your camera to do what you want to achieve in your photo or video. There is no quote unquote right settings. It's about what you like and what looks good to you and what helps you accomplish your goal. And the very last setting on the right side of my camera is creative filters. Now obviously I can't pick any of these because my camera is on manual mode, but these just give you different options on creative ways to film your videos or how to like add creative effects to your pictures. Very self-explanatory. Now, if you are a little bit overwhelmed and you have no idea what settings to start with, I would recommend putting your resolution on full HD, maybe 60 or 30 frames per second, keeping your picture style on auto, keeping your white balance on auto white balance. And then for your video mode, I would recommend, I don't know, maybe jump into the manual mode and learn how to balance your exposure. Okay, so my vlog camera died. So as I was saying, I would go into practicing shooting with your camera on manual just to get used to balancing your exposure. But if that is a little too overwhelming of a thought right now, I would say jump in on aperture priority so you can change your aperture and then your camera will change the rest of your settings. Or if even that is too overwhelming, there is no shame in just jumping in on auto and then practicing a little bit more in your free time. That is it for today's video. I hope that this was thorough but simple enough for you to understand as a beginner. Like I said in the beginning, if you got overwhelmed at any point, I hope you paused and took a deep breath, or even just come back to this video over time as you continue to learn. But that is it for today's lesson on how to use your DSLR camera. I hope this helped you figure out what settings you want to use when you film. I hope I pointed you in the right direction. Like I said, my analogies were meant to help with simplicity. They were not perfect by any means, but I will have resources linked below for you to check out to help you get a little bit more in depth of an understanding on how your camera works. If you have any questions or misunderstandings, or if there's anything that you can explain better than what I did in this video, please comment them down below. And please help me out by giving this video a thumbs up, because it is almost 5 o'clock and I started filming at 2, and this is probably going to take much longer to edit. So liking this video just really helps me out. It makes me feel like this wasn't for no reason, because someone benefited from it and, you know, learned from it or enjoyed it. So please like this video if you enjoyed. Share this with someone who just got a fancy camera and hasn't used it yet. Subscribe if you want content creator tips and you're new on your journey and need help along the way. And I will see you guys in my next video.